In English, the word fear usually means something we need to be afraid of. In theological terms, it means something a little different. Today, I'd like to talk about that. Stay tuned. Hello, friends. Pastor Tim Westermeyer here, Senior Pastor of St. Philip the Deacon in the western suburbs of Minneapolis. Good to be with you as always. As I mentioned at the start of last week's episode, we're sort of in the middle of a series or mini-series here of responding to listener questions, so I want to pick that up again. A few of you got back to me very quickly with some really important and thoughtful questions. I'm still thinking about those, sitting with those, and we'll get to them, I promise. Today, I do want to respond to what I think is a relatively straightforward question about what does this whole thing mean about fearing God, which comes up in both biblical phrases and sometimes prayers. And so I want to lift up really just one verse, which is, I think, a good representative verse of that language, which is Proverbs verse 1, or chapter 1, verse 7. Which in the NRSV version of the Bible, which is the one we use here at St. Philip the Deacon, reads as follows: "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction." So again, the first half of that is, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And so in English, obviously, fear has overtones of being afraid of something, being scared of something, that something is a threat to you. And I want to suggest today that is probably not a helpful way to read that passage. And I'm going to do that by talking a little bit about original languages and maybe another translation of this, and also just a couple of notes. So that passage is originally, where it is from the what Christians would call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. And therefore it was written in Hebrew. And I studied Hebrew in seminary. I do not profess to be an expert at it. But the original word there for fear, that's translated fear, is yirah, which certainly could mean fear in the way I mentioned it before, but it also has overtones of being something that is awesome or deserves our reverence. Later, by the way, that Hebrew text will be translated both into Greek and Latin. In Greek, the word is translated phobos. It's from the Hebrew to Greek, phobos. Again, that can have overtones of awe or reverence. In Latin, it's translated to Timor, which interestingly, last week I talked about my story. My very name actually includes that Latin word Timor. It's Timotheos is my name in Latin or Greek, and that means, again, a reverence or awe, Timor, for God, Theos, right? So it's in some way, it's a very personal, and I've known that for my whole life, actually, that translation. I do think that it actually impacted my own story. That's another episode, though. Back to Proverbs. Let's see. In another translation, or actually I'll read a couple of notes about this. I've got a whole lot of books here today. This is actually another, it's a, not a direct translation. Well, I'm forgetting the word now, but this is by Eugene Peterson. So he reads this way. This, again, same passage, Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7. "Start with God. The first step in learning is bowing down to God. Only fools thumb their noses at such wisdom and learning." So there, I kind of like the way he does that. He doesn't say the fear of the Lord, but rather he just says, start with God. And again, here I am going to read, this is a note from a Bible dictionary. Fear of the Lord, the awe, again, that word keeps coming up, awe, reverence, the awe that a person ought to have before God. As such, it can be said to constitute true religion. And I think there was one other thing I was going to read. Oh, it's a note from this other translation. This is the NIV Study Bible. And this note says about chapter 1, verse 7, the theme of the book. In other words, the theme of Proverbs. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That's the theme of the book, this note says. a loving reverence for God that includes submission to his lordship and belief in his promises. All right, so again, fundamentally, fear of the Lord, when we talk about that, and I'll be quick to say, I'm focusing on one verse here. This is not exhaustive. It's not comprehensive. There are probably other verses you could lift up that those same words I've mentioned, either Hebrew or Greek, where maybe the word fear is more directly related to how we would think about it in English. But in this context, it's really about, again, awe or reverence or worship or bowing down. And so I want to compare and contrast that to other things that we might bow down to. And again, some people have said, I think rightly, that the biblical narrative in some ways is a reminder again and again and again to not put something in the place of God that isn't God. The sort of technical word for that is to make an idol out of something. In the 21st century, I think we tend to say, idols are something that only primitive people had, a little sculpture or something. We're far too sophisticated to bow down to idols. I mean, come on. We're way smarter than that. I disagree. I think human beings, we are wired to worship something, to have awe, to have reverence for something. And when we no longer place God in that location of awe and reverence, back to that verse in Proverbs, something else will fill it. I think I may have talked about this in another episode, but I'll just repeat quickly. Classically, and this is maybe lifted up most by Thomas Aquinas, the four things that end up for human beings taking the place of God are power, pleasure, honor, and wealth. Okay, and again, I don't care if we're in the 21st century, we bow down to those all the time. And I've just actually listened to some podcasts from people who are very successful. And this is a theme you hear again and again and again from people who are sort of self-reflective and maybe have been very successful in their lives. They come to a point often when they realize those four things, power, pleasure, honor, wealth, do not satisfy them at the deepest level of who they are. They don't make them feel complete. They don't make them feel whole. The only thing, Christians would argue, people of faith would argue, that can do that is God. So again, back to that first or the seventh verse of chapter 1 of Proverbs, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Recognizing that we have to start with God, not with those other things. And then when we do that, when we start with God, all of those other things, which are not bad in and of themselves, but need to just be located correctly in the hierarchy of goods, fall into their correct place. And we live, I would argue, a more faithful, healthy, happy, joy-filled life. So that's a response to the question about the fear of the Lord, or at least a beginning response. As always, if you have questions about that or something else, I hope you'll include them in the comments below. It's good to be with you. I've been traveling a little bit over the last few days. It's good to be back home again. And until next time, as always, be well, stay in touch, and God bless.